Welcome back, class. During the last segment, we finished our conversation of cognitive development by looking at Kohlberg's level of moral thinking. Now we're going to be looking at social development. We'll be relying greatly on the work of Erik Erikson, who developed the psychosocial stages of development. So when it comes to identity, adolescent's task is to solidify sense of self by testing and integrating various roles. So during this time frame, one can have colored hair or a mohawk or have several piercings. But the idea is ultimately you'll be integrating all these cells that you have developed into one unified identity. Confidence and identity typically falls during the early to mid-teen years, often rebounds by the end of college years. We also have group identity, often formed by how we differ from others, and social identity, the we aspect of self-concept. The answer to who am I comes from group memberships, according to Erikson, as well as your distinctiveness from them. And then there is intimacy, the ability to form developmental tasks in young adulthood. The idea here is this: by the time we come up with an identity during this stage of development, it helps us prepare for young adulthood later, where intimacy will be a key component. So let's look a little bit more carefully at the stages of psychosocial stages of development as Erik Erikson saw them. So what we have here is Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. We've talked about one of them already, or two of them actually. So let's look at them real quickly here. We have the first stage of infancy, from birth to around 1 year. This has as its major issue a sense of trust versus mistrust. If needs are dependably met, the infants develop a sense of basic trust. And we saw earlier how this may have an influence on one's attachment style later. Then we move to toddlerhood, from 1 to 3 years of age. We can also note that the terrible twos are located within this toddlerhood stage here. The main issue from a social perspective here is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Toddlers learn to exercise their will and do things for themselves, or they doubt their abilities. So it would not be uncommon for a toddler in this age frame here to say something like this. They're trying to do something, you try to intervene to help them out, they'll say, "Stop, I can do it." Here, they're trying to exercise their autonomy. Then we have the preschool stage, from 3 to 6 years. Here, initiative versus guilt. Preschoolers learn to initiate tasks and carry out plans, or they feel guilty about their efforts to be independent. The elementary school stage, 6 years to puberty. Competency versus inferiority is the issue here. Children learn the pleasure of applying themselves to tasks, or they feel inferior. And then we have adolescence, from your teen years into your 20s. The key role here is identity versus role confusion. This was the key point of the previous slide: identity versus role confusion. Teenagers work at refining a sense of self by testing roles and then integrating them to form a single identity, or they become confused about who they are. Now, the key thing here for this stage of adolescence and for them to come out of this stage with a sense of identity is this: the next stage. The next stage of young adulthood will require a great deal that you have a sense of identity. I'm sure you've heard of this before. It is very difficult to get into a successful, intimate relationship if one does not know who they are first before they can relate to others. That's the key point. In the adolescent stage of development, success is you coming out of that particular stage with a sense of identity, which will help when it goes to the next stage of young adulthood, which goes from the 20s to the early 40s. The issue here is one of intimacy versus isolation. Young adults struggle to form close relationships and to gain the capacity for intimate love, or they feel socially isolated. So, intimacy versus isolation. Success here is developing a sense of intimacy. If not, if you can't do that, maybe because you have not successfully gotten a sense of identity, then most likely the end result of that stage will be one of social isolation. Then we go to middle adulthood, from the 40s to the 60s. Here, the issue is one of generativity, that's generativity versus stagnation. Generativity is a sense of giving back, of providing to previous generations, or future generations, excuse me. So generativity, giving to the future generations, as opposed to stagnation, like a stagnant water somewhere in the woods somewhere just sitting there. So in middle age, people discover a sense of contributing to the world, usually through family and work, or they may feel a lack of purpose. That would be stagnation. So giving back or contributing is generativity. Then we have late adulthood, from late 60s on up. Here, the issue is integrity versus despair. So in this task that one has in front of us, you are going to be reflecting on his or her life, looking back at the life that you have lived. An older adult may feel a sense of satisfaction about the life they have lived. That would be a sense of integrity, that you did the best you could and you were able to succeed in many areas. Or despair, a sense of failure, that as you look back on your life, you do not have a sense of satisfaction, but a sense of dissatisfaction. So, according to Eric Erickson, we go through these stages of psychosocial development. Each one has a strong social connotation to it, from the sense of trust versus mistrust, all the way to integrity versus despair. Now, looking at parent and peer relationships, also a major role in developing ourselves socially. So let's look at it from a different perspective, from the social development aspect of it. So we see when it comes to parent-peer relationships, there's going to be a diminishing parental and increasing peer influence for Western cultural peers. Basically saying this: as parents' influence decreases, the influence of peers increases. So parental influence decrease, peer influence increase. Affected by attachments and perceptions as well. So puberty affects attachments and perceptions. Selection effect often is seen here. We do see that parent-child arguments are more likely over mundane topics, greater with firstborns and mothers, and with gender differences. Occasionally lead to splits into stress. It can be influenced by a variety of factors. The positive parent-teen and peer relations are related to several things such as networking or how to deal with finances and money. The key thing here is that there are going to be some social changes as to who is getting influenced by who. For example, parents may influence still in certain areas, but peers will influence in things dealing with social factors, entertainment, what is popular, fashion sense, and things of that nature, where parents may still have some influence dealing with things such as career choices and money. Now, the concept of emerging adulthood. Is emerging adulthood a developmental stage? Which information from your text supports your answer. Well, think about that question, but what it comes down to is this. Adulthood these days, or emerging adulthood, is sort of seen as a stage that says you're not necessarily an adolescent anymore, but you're not fully independent. And previously, in the previous slide, we talked about adulthood as being a sense of being independent, being able to stand on your own. But based on numerous factors such as the economy and other situations, even pandemics, we see that you may not fully be independent. You may be independent in many areas, but not fully independent. Therefore, they have come up with this term, the emerging adulthood, to represent the fact that sometimes, based on many factors, someone may have to return home or seek some sort of assistance from their parental units. That does not necessarily say that they are independent, but they are demonstrating an emerging adulthood. Now, transition to adulthood. Well, we want to talk here real quickly about the idea of how it has changed over the centuries. So let's look at the transition. We can look at females here, 1890 versus 2006. So what we're seeing here is, when do people get married? When do females get married? So if we go all the way back to 1890, from the first period, which we were talking about just prior to the 15th birthday, there will be an interval of 7.2 years before marriage would be present. So here we see a 7.2-year interval from first period to marriage. In 2006, we see that the period has started much earlier. So not 15 anymore. It's more like 12, 13 years of age where we see the period starting. And then there has been also an increase in the amount of time to get married. So now we don't see a 7.2-year interval from first period to marriage. We see a 14.2-year interval for first period to marriage. Now, what's happening? Well, there's a variety of factors going on, but one that is most significant is because of adolescence, we have this protective bubble, so we're not seeing people get married too soon, but also it's going to be the choices that we see people make during the 2000s and well after the 1890s. First of all, women are delaying giving birth and getting married in lieu of getting their education first, starting a career. Therefore, time frame has sort of been extended to wait for marriage to happen closer to 30 as opposed to closer to 20. So we see that this is a thing that does happen as well, that society changes, society that's very healthy, which we are for the most part, a very healthy society, well nourished. There is a tendency for periods to start earlier in very healthy societies like ours. So we see that this transition to adulthood has changed based on a variety of other factors as well. So as we go into middle adulthood, we see that there are going to be some physical changes, physical development and changes. So we have imperceptible changes in muscular strength during middle adulthood, reaction time, sensory keenness or the sharpness of our senses, and our cardiac output, how efficient we are, will change as we get into middle adulthood. There's also going to be a gradual decline in fertility for males and females, and also lessened sexual activity. So as we get older, certain types of things start to become less capable with. We are going to be less capable of being as strong as we once were. Our reaction time slows, and so on and so on. Now, in late adulthood, we see a continuing decrease in muscle strength, reaction time, stamina, vision, and so on. Also seeing decreases in our sense of smell, hearing, and touch. We do see a weakened immune system to some degree, so new things can cause us some issues. We have fewer short-term ailments. We do have a lot of immunities, but developing new immunities may be somewhat more difficult. The slower reaction time, decreased perceptual and memory ability, other cognitive declines related directly to changes in the brain, compensating neuroplasticity. So the notion here is that we do see some declines in our mental capability. Now, it should be noted that exercise slows aging. It enhances bone and muscles, it helps prevent obesity, and slows Alzheimer's disease progression. So someone who's been very physical and exercised most of their life, they'll probably age much better, okay, be much healthier as they get older compared to someone who did not take good care of themselves earlier in their life. They have not established those healthy habits of exercising on a daily basis and things of that nature. Now, when it comes to memory, aging and memory, it should be first noted that we don't always lose our memory as drastically as one would think based on diseases such as Alzheimer's and other dementias. Those are disorders. They are not how we naturally go about losing our memory, even though our memory is not going to always be as sharp as it was when we were younger. With age, some things are remembered well, okay? Individual differences do occur in the capacity to learn and to remember. Memory depends on the type of information being retrieved, its meaningfulness, and comprehension versus production. We do see the tip of the tongue phenomena occurring where we forget uh, key information. For example, the tip of the tongue phenomena is when we know somebody. It's like when someone asks you, do you know the star who starred in such and such movie? And all of a sudden you knew who that person was as they were asking the question, but you can't get the name. You've remembered everything about it except for the name of that individual. That thing can happen quite a bit as well. We'll see more about memory in an upcoming chapter. But the point here is that memory, there are going to be some declines in memory as we age. But some types of memories we'll be able to have greater access to. So things that we already know, we can have great access to them. But learning new things may be a little bit more difficult at times. So when it comes to cognitive development as we age, we see here in this graph the percentage of names recalled, okay, and then the age in years. So you can see here quite clearly that after one introduction, our ability to recall names is much lower compared to the individuals who are in their teenage years compared to someone who's 70 to 90. We see after two introductions, it goes higher and higher. So with multiple introductions, we see that our memory gets better. Now, looking at the number of words remembered, we see a word list here, and the number of words recalled declines with age. The number of words recognized is stable with age. So we have the ability to recognize things, but the idea of being able to recall them, to dredge them up on our own, is going to be greatly affected. So it depends on how we're needing to access information. Is it simply something to recognize or something that we need to generate or recall on our own? We will see a great deal of difference there when it comes to memory. So maintaining mental abilities. Brain plasticity is a lifelong phenomenon. Individuals who engage in brain fitness programs show improved scores on trained tasks, less generalization to other tasks. So the idea here is that if you keep your brain active, that can be of some benefit to maintaining some of your mental abilities. Age is less a predictor of memory and intelligence than of proximity to death. So the idea here is age is not something that helps us with a predictor of our memory and our intelligence than is how close we may be to death, which we refer to as a terminal decline as we see our mental abilities start to go down when we're talking about people in late adulthood here. So adulthood's ages and stages. So we may also have a couple other things that we need to talk about quickly here. We have the midlife crisis. I'm sure you've heard of that before. There is little support for the perception of the midlife transition as a crisis. So we can think of it as a midlife transition. It is a major event, not an age. A major event usually triggers the crisis in about 1 in 4 adults. So it's not something that happens all the time as we age. What happens is there could be some significant event in one's life, a loss of job, a death of a loved one, or whatever, that may help to trigger a particular crisis that's happening during this time frame. So life events trigger transitions to new life stages. Now, this is also something too that does affect us all. There is a social clock that exists for us all. Uh, in class, if I ask my class of freshman students for the most part in a psychology class, what happens after high school, I can almost tell you people will say college, and after college they'll say something like work. After you had your career going on, what happens next? Marriage, and then so on and so forth. We all sort of have an understanding of what the expectations are. Uh, and this sort of represents our social clock when things are supposed to happen. The social clock does vary depending on the eras and cultures. I mean, a couple of hundred years ago, the same question would probably get slightly different responses to a different class of that particular era. So we do see that life events trigger transitions, but there's also this social clock that we as members of a cultured society have about what the expectations are. Now, these chance events can impact the life path. So sometimes something unexpected may occur and it may alter the course of your life to some degree. So these transitions are also there and possible as well. So real quickly, look at a couple of psychosocial development things for some additional slides I have here. We've talked about the midlife crisis may not be a function of age. People do feel pressured by this social clock, however, as an achievement of expectation. So Erik Erikson's observations of age-related issues, as we saw previously, we say when you are a young person in young adulthood, you may have people pressuring you by way of parents or grandparents about when you are going to what? Get married. And then if you are married, when you're going to have children, and so on and so forth. So these things are part of the things that influence our life and how we live it. So social development, basic aspects of adult life. We have intimacy, forming close relationships, generativity, being productive and supporting future generations. We also have love, relatively monogamous pairing, similarity of interest and values, emotional and material support, and intimate self-disclosures are usually things that we associate with love. Age and education level also could be some type of thing that influences who we love. Age appropriate, similar backgrounds in education. No cohabitation before marriage. The idea here is we do not see that cohabitation seems to be any more or less beneficial to the success of marriage. The ratio of positive and negative interactions, that's one key thing to determine love. Are you having more positive interactions than negative interactions? And of course, another key factor in our life, our social life as well, is going to be work. Work is a major influence, particularly in our culture and Western cultures like ours. Work takes up a considerable amount of time and energy in our life. Interest, sense of competency, and accomplishment fit all come to give us a strong sense of work identity. In fact, to be honest with you, if you go to another part of the world and you're at a party and you're talking to people and they ask you what you do, you are more likely to say what your job is or what you're being trained for in college for your future career. That's how we identify ourselves. But in other parts of the world, that may not be how they respond. You ask somebody from a different culture, what is it that you do? You may get the response, I like to climb mountains. They're talking about something that they are passionate about, but not necessarily about their work, their occupation. So let's look real quickly here at well-being across the lifespan. Well-being is related to life satisfaction, positive feelings, enhanced emotional control, and positive relationships. Again, not age. You're going to be very satisfied and have a good sense of well-being at just about any time frame. It's not an age-related type of idea. The aging brain nurtures positive feelings, less responsive amygdala. So the aging brain nurtures positive feelings. We have a less responsive amygdala, however. Bad feelings associated with negative events fade faster. And what we see when it comes to this idea of successful aging is this. There are going to be, as we've seen so far in this course, a biopsychosocial influences on aging. The biological influences are going to be things such as the genetic predisposition, early cognitive or physical decline, and appropriate nutrition are going to be some of the biological influences. Some of the psychological one is, do you maintain an optimistic outlook? Optimism is basically seeing the world primarily as a half full as opposed to half empty, looking for the positive things in life as opposed to looking for the negative or dwelling on the negative things. Physically and mentally active lifestyles that you mentally engage yourself through games, activities, and through conversations, and physically you get out there and you exercise. These things all play a role psychologically in your lifestyles that you have to help you become a more successful ager. And then we have the social cultural influences as well. Support from family and friends is a key ingredient there. Cultural respect for aging, as well as safe living conditions. All of these play a significant role in our ability to age. Now, one last thing as I wrap it up is going to be about death and dying. So, in developmental psychology, normally the way it's taught, it goes from conception to death. And so this chapter goes from conception, from the zygote that we talked about previously, to death. So death and dying. Reaction to a loved one's death varies by individuals and by cultures. There is no prescribed way to go through the grieving process. Terminally ill and bereaved people do not go through identical predictable stages. There are certain types of guidelines or guides that people can use to sort of explain what people may be going through, but it's not always going to be so predictable. Those who express the strongest grief immediately do not purge grief more quickly. Bereavement therapy and self-help groups offer support, but similar healing occurs with the passage of time, support of friends, and supporting others. Facing imminent death due to terminal illness is more positive and less sad than imagined. It does sort of crystallize those things which are important to you in your life. And finally, coping with death and dying. As I was saying earlier, individuals' responses to death may vary. Grief is more intense when death occurs, usually unexpectedly, especially if also too early on the social clock that we described. They died too early in life, the social clock. As we have in the social clock, believe it or not, an idea of when death should occur. We're talking about after a long life has been lived, since you've done all your things, that's an appropriate time, as opposed to someone who's just starting their life out. There is no standard pattern or length to the grieving process, and it seems to help to have the support of friends or groups and to face the reality of death and grief while affirming the value of life.